On January 8, 1892, American newspapers reported the death on her ranch of Marie Suize, a determined Savoyard woman from Thones, who emigrated to San Francisco in 1850, drawn by the furor over the discovery of gold. According to the gold diggers, she managed to amass a fortune in this tough trade. Every contemporary Frenchman of that time remembers this woman, who combined a remarkable capacity for work with extraordinary energy and called herself Marie Pantalon.
She probably extracted more than a cubic meter of gold.
U.S. law prohibited women from wearing men's clothing.
A woman who's extremely famous and much talked about in the newspapers, but then completely fell into oblivion during the 20th century.
To think, if this young woman can do that, I can do what I want to do.
Marie Suize was born in the early 19th century at the foot of the Alps, which were not yet French.
Marie was born on 14 July 1824 in Thones, a mid-mountain range village about 20 kilometers from Annecy. She was the seventh of 12 children. Her father was Claude Suize and her mother, Marie Adelaide Machet. He was an innkeeper and also had an establishment he called the Hôtel de Russie.
The parents had 12 children and probably didn't have the means to give their daughter a big enough dowry for her to marry a craftsman or a man of the same background. At the time, people married into the same social class and sought equality of status above all. So what happened is that the parents did not have enough money for even a modest dowry. By dowry, I'm not talking about giving her a substantial sum of money. Girls only received money, while boys generally inherited the family home, for example. But there were 12 children here, so some of the children were forced to leave.
At that time, Savoy was a poor region with a very high immigration rate, considerable seasonal immigration in winter when there was less agricultural activity, and also immigration for several years, sometimes even for good. The most popular destinations were Lyon and Paris. At the time, Paris was a leading Savoyard city. Paris had 20,000 Savoyards living there, with a lot of natives of Thones and Saint-Jean-de-Six. And that's where she went, joining her two older brothers who were already there.
Paris, 1846. Marie was hired as a housemaid by a Parisian family.
At the time, most middle and upper-class families obviously had people to help them at home. The less skilled had what was called a maid-of-all-work, although the term arrived a little later in the century. Someone who did all the menial tasks. Then obviously, the higher you went in the social hierarchy, the more valets, maids, and cooks there were. So Marie probably was hired as a maid in a Parisian family.
A short-lived experience that left her completely destitute and seems to have been a turning point in her life.
The only hint we have is towards the end of her life, when she confided that she was in a grave situation and she had lost her job. We don't know why she did not find another one. No doubt it went very badly with the people who hired her. She was reduced to extreme poverty and lived homeless under Pont Neuf.
For her to find herself on the street, when she had been in a house as a maid until then, there must have been a problem with one or more of the men in the household.
It's possible she was sexually assaulted. After all, it was very common. Historians tell us that it was very widespread in those days. little was said about these things, and nobody thought it was wrong.
Mais que c'était peu dit et encore moins condamné.
Elle est retrouvée par une femme, d'après toujours ses souvenirs.
She said she was found under the Pont Neuf in Paris.
Donc, cette femme-là va être sa
This woman saved her life
qui va lui permettre
because she found her a job
et donc, très
and probably a room
chambre pour pouvoir vivre.
so that she could live safely in a big, dangerous city like Paris was for young girls at the time.
Dangereuse qui est à l'époque Paris pour les jeunes filles.
She was hired by a Parisian newspaper, and there she learned the news that shook the world.
We don't know which newspaper she worked for or what her job was.
En tout cas, c'est là.
In any case, that's where she heard about California and the gold rush.
Et de la ruée vers l'or.
Gold was discovered in California in 1848, and news seemed to travel faster to other countries other than the US. And there was a lot of excitement in France beginning in 1848 and into 1849.
We should remember the historical background of California, which was Hispanic. That's why we have names like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Monterey, which was the capital.
Monterey, qui était la capitale, etc., etc.
Just before California was bought by the United States, the Mexican governor had granted a huge concession to Johann Sutter, a German-speaking Swiss farmer who had come to work in the region. He then sent one of his men, James Marshall, to Coloma to build a sawmill.
Marshall diverted the course of the river, and when the riverbed was drained of water, he saw something glittering that turned out to be a gold nugget, and then saw a few more. He quickly returned to Sutter's fort. Sutter had constructed his buildings where Sacramento is now, and they both started to determine if it really was gold.
Et tous les deux, ils s'emploient à vérifier que c'est bien de l'or.
When they felt sure it was gold, Sutter had only one thing in mind: to hurry and get his title confirmed quickly by the new American authorities. The original title had been granted by the Mexican authorities, so it had to be confirmed by the new authorities. Sutter and Marshall intended to keep it a secret. The man who truly started the gold rush was a Mormon journalist named Sam Brannan.
Sam Brannan.
Sam Brennan, having heard of the discovery and being an exceptionally good entrepreneur, hastened to buy all the necessary equipment and supplies. Then he went on a wild ride through the streets of San Francisco with a gold flask in his hand, shouting, "Gold! Gold from the American River."
So it's Brannan who set the stage for the early rush to gold.
Le 5 décembre,
On 5 December 1848, the then President of the United States, James Polk, made his State of the Union address in which he justified his policy. He had been roundly criticized because the war fought with Mexico from 1846 to 1848 and the purchase of California for $15 million.
tout cela, c'était très cher.
It was all very expensive, and his political opponents criticized him for the enormous expenses. So for him to be able to say that the purchased territories were immensely rich in gold justified his policy.
Ces territoires achetés sont en fait immensément riches en or, ça justifie sa politique.
À partir de là,
From here on, everything moved very quickly. There was no longer any doubt. People knew there was gold in California through various official sources. When folks met on the street, the question was not, "Are you going to California?" but "When are you leaving?" There was no longer any doubt. People felt impelled to set out and be part of this California adventure.
Californienne.
There were many posters about go to California. And I think that's probably how she found out. And she saw other people leaving. And she wanted to go because there she could be free.
So every day, Frenchmen read ads in the newspaper about ships leaving for California. And since Marie Suize worked for a newspaper, she was one of the first to hear about this. And for all those French people living in the turmoil of 1848, the lure of gold was a natural escape. They see it as a new path that opens before them and promises to give them everything they ever dreamed of. In 1848, France experienced a major social, economic, and political crisis. So there were several good reasons to leave the country at the time. This is what those interested in migration phenomena call the push. That is, the push to leave. It led to a migration bubble, a phenomenon that mushroomed very suddenly and that stopped very quickly between 1849 and 1856. During this period, there were several waves of migration. The first consisted of pioneers, and Marie Suize was part of this wave.
Marie's news story was written in the registers of the ship Le Ferrier. She was among the 155 passengers who departed Le Havre on June 22, 1850.
The 155 passengers included 17 or 19 women. This is quite a large number all the same. I studied almost 2,000 passengers, and about 8% were women. There were very few women, but that was to be expected. It was a pioneer migration, and it's normal in migration phenomena that the men would leave first, hoping to bring their families later.
À l'époque, la route la plus directe.
At that time, the most direct route was from Le Havre, down the southern Atlantic, around Cape Horn, and up the Pacific coast to California.
Conditions below deck were horrific. Men were on one side and women on the other, with very little space for passengers and their belongings. Often, hams and sausages hung from the ceiling. There was very little light, and truly appalling smells coming from the hold. For the steerage passengers, the conditions were far from ideal to make the trip. The journey was a considerable ordeal. First of all, due to seasickness. Those poor passengers were trapped because, of course, everything had to be closed to prevent water from getting inside the ship. They lived in very frightening, overcrowded conditions in the dark. At the time, there was no electricity, so they had lanterns and candles, all fire hazards. So in the darkness, everyone thought their last hour had come, since most of them had lived on the land and had never been on a ship before.
Qui n'ont jamais pris le navire auparavant.
The curious thing was that when they finally landed, they were so used to the pitching and rolling of the ship that they fell down as soon as they set foot on land. It was a weird experience one would not want to have today.
Almost 6 months after setting out, Le Ferrier entered San Francisco Bay, the gateway to the New World.
And that's when they discovered the legendary forests of masts. There were the masts of hundreds of ships abandoned by their crews, who had made straight for the mines. When they dropped anchor, they were able to see the city. And that too was an unforgettable experience because it looked like a huge fairground with wood shacks, tents, and bivouacs as far as you can see. So it's November 1850. The whole world arrives, and there's constant excitement and movement. Everyone is here to make money, so they're always on the lookout to seize every opportunity.
I'm in San Francisco. No matter what the newspapers, letters, and literary descriptions say, you can't get any idea of this country if you haven't seen it. People and houses keep changing place and get moving at daybreak like ants in a teeming anthill. You go through a piece of land and there's only brush in the morning. You come back in the evening and there may be 5 or 6 houses, new ones or some brought in from another part of town. As for the Americans, nothing surprises them. They see and do the most gigantic things with a calm composure that makes you think they are mad. One fine morning when you wake up, you no longer see the mountain you were looking at just a week ago. 5 or 6 Americans have bought it, and to have a good piece of land have thrown it in the sea. The sea is not deep there, and they have filled it in up to 1/4 mile. And a week after that, there's a quay, a new port, 150 new houses and shops, and 20 or 25 ships unloading their goods. And the Americans have earned 5 or 6 million.
As soon as they arrived, they went from one amazing discovery to another. They became part of a legend, in fact, and they realized that from now on, this was no longer an ordinary journey. Now they had to fight for their own survival in a place with no laws, no hospitals, and no social structure, where they now had to fend for themselves.
2 years before, this city had only 800 or 900 inhabitants. Now there were thousands, maybe tens of thousands. And it is estimated that 2 years after that it had some 90,000 residents. So it was a mushrooming city, one of extraordinary growth. We can't say there were houses. More likely, people lived in tents. And there were people from all over the world speaking every possible language. Marie surely did what migrants have done through the ages. She must have tried to find people who spoke French.
Apparently, she tried to find work in San Francisco. And most of the work for women was taking care of men, serving them food, serving them housing, washing their clothes, of course. And probably, well, there were the prostitutes too. So she couldn't find any work that she wanted to do and not get stuck with women's work.
The few women in the new city fell into 2 categories, clearly separated in terms of morality. And Marie, she headed for the gold country. San Francisco Bay is the largest estuary of the 2 Americas. 40% of California rivers flow into this bay, including the Sacramento and the San Joaquin. It was these 2 rivers that led the miners to the gold fields.
So Marie Suize took a steamboat that landed her in Stockton. And then she still had to walk for about 80 kilometers. And it wasn't in a straight line. It wasn't as easy as it is today. At the end of that walk, she actually entered the region of the gold fields.
She reached Jackson. It was a very small town of a few dozen buildings, hastily made of wood since there was no stone. The main street featured a landmark at the entrance, a large tree. It was the hanging tree. It was first used on an Indian, they said. His name was Joe, Joe the Indian.
At the time, the problem was the infrastructure. There was nothing. There was no police or institutions, and state services were practically non-existent. It was a pretty violent world, and that's one of the reasons why there were very few women.
Et c'est une des raisons pour lesquelles il y a très peu de femmes.
Jackson was, at that time, becoming some kind of a town. One of the things that impressed me about the descriptions of San Francisco and Jackson and any of those places there was the description of the roads in town. They couldn't call them roads, they called them mud holes, because that's what they were. And people would throw their clothes into it, their garbage. Animals would be running around, rats. And I'm sure at that point, Marie was wearing pants, I would think. Imagine trying to walk through a mud hole with long dresses and getting mud all over the dress. It would take a lot just to wash it. And that kept a lot of women at home, but not Marie. Marie by then would have put on pants and boots and some say a sombrero hat. And that way, she had some freedom already when she arrived in Jackson.
Gold panning requires a lot of physical strength. You work with your feet in ice-cold water that comes down from the mountains, under a blazing sun that bakes you. You must wear a hat, and you have to work like that for hours on end. So I think Marie had the capacity for this work. She was used to the cold. Now she was experiencing the heat, especially the California heat, which can be overwhelming. But I think she had all the qualities she needed to find gold in the rivers, and that she arrived early enough to make some fantastic discoveries. Since there was still some gold on the surface of the land, for example, gold could be pried out with knives from small cracks in the rocks. You could lift small rocks and sometimes find nuggets underneath. There were a lot of simple ways to harvest gold by hand. But of course, you still had to be lucky. You had to be in the right place at the right time. And in that respect, Marie's Savoyard side interests me. She knew the elements and nature. When I see myself in the gold country, I can't imagine all that. But I think someone like her could find the right place, the right ravine, the right riverbank, where to search and find. And that's what's important.
It is true that she quickly made an impression. There are a lot of testimonies about her. She was noticed right away. A few years later, when travelers arrived in California, they soon heard about the people who really stood out, and they included Marie Pantalon, Marie Suize. What made her instantly remarkable was that she worked like a man and behaved like a man, almost to the point of mimicry. She smoked, drank, and frequented saloons. She carried revolvers. It wasn't just the work. This work was different from the traditional hard physical work of women. Historians are well aware that women have always worked hard, that they didn't just keep house. No, this was really male behavior. And then, of course, there were the pants.
C'est aussi un comportement d'homme, et puis la tenue, évidemment.
After talking about men for so long, let's say something about the women. Although there were certainly still very few of them in California, especially in the mines, I can cite one whom the miners called Joan of Arc, who became quite a legend in the history of California. She worked like a man in the goldfields and smoked a pipe. Another one again in California, where she ran a productive claim, answered to the name of Marie Pantalon. She had this nickname because of the clothing she chose to wear. She was French, like Joan of Arc, and only the French could submit with such ease and cheerfulness to such a new situation. Americans who did not understand that the place of women could be outside the home or doing other work greatly admired the manly courage of Joan of Arc and Marie Pantalon in California.
In fact, Marie Pantalon was Marie Suize. She was in the process of acquiring her new name. And as for Joan of Arc, who is presented here as another person, we have another testimony in the United States which proves it was also her nickname. So we wonder if this could be the same person, who is sometimes called Joan of Arc, sometimes Marie Pantalon. Well, technically, she wasn't French, since Savoy was still independent and was still part of the kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia until 1860.
We can believe that men considered her as an equal, i.e., someone who was like them, able to endure extremely trying work, who knew what to do and how to get by. In California, women were pretty well treated because there weren't many of them. There were both psychological and economic reasons for wanting to bring in more women. Psychologically, because these men were alone, far from their families. They thought of their mothers. They thought of their sisters and wives. And economically, it was important to have a woman in the family unit. Otherwise, what would the men do? They'd go off and gamble, hence men's interest in bringing in women. But Marie Suize did not fit into this traditional pattern, since she behaved like a man.
One thing I want to talk about is what we call the cult of true womanhood. This was a set of codes, especially in the 19th century, certainly in the US, and I'm sure in France too. It was a code of behavior for women, the way that women were supposed to conduct themselves. They were to be pious, pure, domestic, and submissive. They were to hold on to religious teachings within their families. They were to guard their sexual purity. They were to, of course, take care of all of the needs of the family, especially the husband. And they were to submit to their husbands in terms of where they wanted to live, how the family was to be organized, and basically their opinions were supposed to be their husband's opinions. This carried through to the whole question of wearing pants.
In the ravines of California, where the gold was found, on the banks were a lot of thorny bushes and shrubs like manzanita that could catch onto you when you passed through them. And it was a very dense sort of vegetation. So the few women who went into the mines wore appropriate clothing, that is, men's clothes. At that time, because there were so few of them, the men didn't pay much attention, or they were a bit curious, but nothing more.
C'est à la fois
Women were saying here, I'm like you. I work like you, as hard as you do. It's also practical. It's not just for show in this case. It's really a desire to wear clothes that are practical. And I also think I'm showing that I'm sexually unavailable.
What's surprising is that Marie was always dealing with men, and she was never alone. She was always in groups. When you had a claim, there had to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of you. We know of several situations where she was with 5 people, and every time she was in a group, with a land claim, for example, it was her name that appeared at the top of the signatures, as though she were the leader. And that's quite surprising. So she obviously had a strong character and was something of a leader who managed to assert herself. And she had to do it in a rather manly way.
On aurait dit à l'époque viril.
In the beginning, when there was enough gold to go around, it was pretty quiet. But after the easy-to-reach gold started to disappear and it started to become harder, there was more competition. The competition seemed to breed violence, fights over territory, over discoveries. And indeed, as we know, Marie was involved in at least one of those. But there were guns, stabbings.
There was a lot of fighting and violence due to the compulsion to take over each other's claims. And often violence broke out between people of different nationalities.
In 1860, Marie Pantalon was managing several claims at Hamburg Hill near Jackson, one of which was next to land claimed by Canadians. The Canadians, having worked right up to their boundaries, thought it would be easy to jump their neighbor's claim. There were a lot of Frenchmen in the diggings who naturally took their compatriots' side. Tempers were mounting and they were ready to come to blows. Marie Pantalon's coolness saved the situation. "Leave it to me," she said. "I'll take care of it." She blocked up a ventilation hole that brought air into the tunnel. The Canadians, in danger of asphyxiation, came out on their own. Armed with 2 revolvers and a bowl of pepper, she moved to the entrance of the tunnel where she had moved her bed. She had given the enemy due warning, pepper first, then if absolutely necessary, the revolvers. For 8 days and nights, she was blocked by a company of 14 men who, however, did not dare to come close enough to force her to use her weapons. When the work was done, they conceded defeat, and peace was made.
The audacity of that woman at that point, and this was not too long after she actually started mining near Jackson. That, I think, gives a whole lot of women a lot of courage to think, if this young woman can do that, I can do what I want to do. And I think she's a fine example of every woman who has a dream, who wants to be herself and not be restricted by people saying what she should do, that she follows her own star to freedom.
Marie caused a sensation and a scandal and truly flourished in her world.
It was really remarkable. She made several fortunes. She made a fortune with the gold mines. We are talking about $100,000, a truly considerable sum. And then she sold her mine for $20,000. These were huge sums of money. Then with a partner, André Douay, she bought a large piece of land where they planted vineyards. She made wine and spirits. And she was the first woman to make wine in Amador County. We think this was in 1865.
Toujours en association avec Douai.
Still in partnership with Douay, she decided to buy a ranch. She wasn't stupid. She felt the mines were bringing in less and less money, and she couldn't just continue with them. So she bought a fairly large ranch, about 300 acres. Maybe she hoped to bring her family there. And in fact, she brought over her younger brother. She wanted to settle and start growing crops, such as fruit trees. She first thought of silkworms, and then vines. That was her big thing, the vineyard.
Elle a un moment pensé aux vers à soie, et puis des cultures de vignes. C'est son grand truc, la vigne. Elle produit beaucoup de vin.
She produced a lot of wine, and brandy too. It's quite interesting to remember that her father ran a cabaret in Thônes, a tavern. She herself wanted to be a wine producer. She advertised herself a lot and opened some wine shops. It was all very respectable. She opened them in the name of Mrs. Pants or Marie Suize PANTALON, depending on the degree of respectability she wanted to have. So we can see that she was playing on her legend and wanted to make the most of her fame to increase her wine sales.
She sold it locally, since there was a market among the miners. She was an ambitious and enterprising woman, and her business grew. There were two markets not far away, San Francisco and Virginia City, which were particularly lucrative.
She advertised her stores in San Francisco and Virginia City, moderate prices and quantities to suit customers.
She took advantage of a law in California, when it was not yet a U.S. state, which exempted unmarried women from paying taxes on their business operations. She argued that she was a young lady who was not married, so it was perfectly normal for her not to be taxed. We can see again how resourceful she was, and that she made the most of every opportunity.
Being rich made her a desirable match, and she must have turned down many proposals. She knew that once she married, she would lose control of her fortune. And right to the end, she definitely wanted to keep her freedom to spend, be an entrepreneur, and travel. Only her status as a single woman would allow her that freedom. Then after the gold rush, in the 1860s and 1870s, there was a paradigm shift, a movement to normalize the situation. In fact, American laws prohibited women from wearing men's clothing. When Marie came out of her mines, she had to comply with these laws. And it was in this context that she was arrested. I don't know if there was any personal vendettas involved, but I think as the society evolved, it was no longer as acceptable as in the early days of the gold rush, when no one cared.
The society was disturbed to see her in pants, and there were several complaints. There was one in Nevada, in her store in the new town of Virginia City, where she had set up shop. She was accused of being a transvestite.
There was two arrests that were quite close together, one in San Francisco and one in Virginia City. This must have really annoyed her a lot because she had been wearing pants for 20 years. And here she was arrested in San Francisco and told that they were going to fine her $5 and they would let her go if she wore dresses. Well, you can imagine what she did. She didn't wear a dress, that's for sure.
Marie was arrested a third time at her home in Jackson.
Et là, c'est assez intéressant.
And that's rather interesting. In Jackson, she was someone important. She was rich and well known. All we know is that there was a meeting, and they decided not to convict her.
La sanctionner, de ne pas la condamner.
Again, how annoying. She's been doing this. This is the way she lives. She has to wear pants to do her work. And so she started pleading her case, and finally the men decided they wanted to go hunting and they were wasting time. And so Marie had her license to wear pants in Jackson.
J'insiste bien. Ça fait partie de sa légende.
It was part of her legend, and she didn't want to get rid of the pants.
Se débarrasser de ce pantalon.
She communicated through them and signed herself Marie Suize PANTALON. And soon, this became Marie Pantalon, or Madame Pantalon. So it shows a society very hostile toward women who didn't stay in their place.
Très hostile, tout simplement.
It also showed that she was pretty smart. It made use of her legend. At the time, there were a few women's associations in California that defended her and used her notoriety to serve their purposes.
De Californie qui vont la défendre et qui vont utiliser cette notoriété au service de leurs revendications.
I found in my study of women's history that whenever women make advances, there's always a reaction, always a backlash. And that was certainly the case with dress reform. So that pants, wearing pants, symbolized rebelling against the restrictions against women and trying to act like men.
Marie Suize was a woman who struggled to broaden women's rights by fighting for herself so that she could do what she wanted to do, move around, earn money, and be independent. She was a very important role model.
She wanted independence, a great deal of freedom, that's for sure. And if women wanted to follow her lead, all well and good. But I don't think there are any texts or writings that show us that she encouraged feminist movements, that she supported them, that she took particular steps to ensure that women had the right to wear pants, for instance. No, her idea was that she could wear them. That said, it was an extremely courageous and useful attitude.
C'est déjà une démarche extrêmement courageuse et très utile.
Marie had the good fortune to arrive in a country where everything had to be built from scratch. She didn't have to deal with the obstacles facing women in old Europe, since one already could speak of old Europe in 19th century France. Marie arrived in a country where everything had to be done and where she believed that all she needed to do was bend down and pick up gold to become fantastically rich. Beyond that, it was a struggle for life, for survival sometimes, but nothing stopped her from becoming very rich. Whereas in France, a young woman could never become really wealthy by working 10 hours a day. It just wasn't possible.
En Californie, tout est possible, même aujourd'hui.
In California, everything was possible. That's true even now.
Dans tous les domaines.
In California at the time, people had complete freedom in every way. It came at a high price because there were a lot of risks involved. But once people faced these risks, once you have triumphed over them, you have proved yourself stronger than adversity. I think the gold rush was a sort of crucible for those who took part of that epic. It proved that they could better themselves. They had to muster strengths they didn't know they had. And that's what happened to Marie Suize.
Et c'est ce qui est arrivé à Marie Suize, c'est qu'elle ne connaissait pas peut-être même toutes les capacités.
Maybe she didn't realize she had so many abilities. They gradually emerged in the small battles she had to fight as a woman among men, and as a French woman in a cosmopolitan environment. She had to fight using all her qualities as a Savoyard, as a level-headed woman who could count pennies, but also show great courage.
A woman of almost indescribable bravery who left too few traces in her life.
The real problem is we don't have a description of her. The only thing that gives a vague idea of her is her signature. And here, we see that she was used to writing. This is a petition for a water supply to be able to continue exploring the hills and subsoils to extract gold. There are about 100 names, and we see one in writing that is much bigger and more refined than the others. Marie Suize PANTALON. In the absence of a portrait, this is what gives us the best picture of her.
C'est, en l'absence de portrait, ce qui lui ressemble le plus.
Seule femme à la signer.
She was the only woman to sign, and it is moving to see Marie Suize PANTALON, and the way she really claims her nickname, Marie PANTALON.
Elle le revendique.
C'est ce qu'on appellerait aujourd'hui une espèce de retournement du stigma.
This is what we would call today a kind of reversal of the stigma. People once derided her because she wore pants. So she decided to claim this as part of her identity and make it a source of pride. In that she was a real forerunner, and she showed her great sense of humor, and yet again, how atypical she was.
Et elle montre qu'elle a beaucoup d'humour, et elle montre une fois de plus, je trouve, une personnalité tout à fait atypique.
But all this success and wealth seems to have gone to her head.
At the end of her life, she undoubtedly exaggerated and bragged a bit, but she did confide in people. We have a few testimonies a year after her death, where she says, rather boastfully, that she probably extracted more than 1 cubic meter of gold, and that's what was reported in the newspapers. This seems a bit inflated, but she also made a lot of bad investments.
Marie made a lot of money. She was successful at mining. And with her business, selling wine and brandy. She also had that gold rush virus of gambling. And she wanted to make yet more money. So she invested in the Comstock lode of gold and silver and started losing money. And instead of taking her losses and leaving it, she kept investing more, trying to get her money back. And in the end, she lost $150,000.
On se prend au jeu quand on cherche de l'or.
You can truly get all caught up in the search for gold. When you find a nugget, you get this rush of joy. It is a perfect moment that you want to see happen again. Gold became harder and harder to find, but there were still great discoveries to be made. And this remained etched on the minds of those who came to be called gold bugs. Prospectors who never wanted to give up, who continued to search for gold all their lives.
Toute leur vie, ils vont continuer à chercher de l'or.
Elle va perdre une grande partie de ses liquidités.
She lost a large part of her money. So at the end of her life, in the 1880s, She was still a wine merchant, and she still had her farm, Secreta Gulch. Her employees included one Lacombe, who left us a lot of interesting information about her life. But basically, she no longer had the fortune she had before we get the impression that she died quite seriously destitute. The last few years were rather sad. In her last year, she was tired, worn out from work, and perhaps from alcohol as well. She was often described as drinking, going to saloons, going to male haunts, and she smoked. She was exhausted, and in the last year, she hardly ever left her ranch. The newspaper report of her death says that she made a slight recovery. She seemed to get better, and then she died in 1892.
Marie Suize disappeared from history, like many early gold rush pioneers. They were forgotten. There was no one left to remember them.
We don't know where she was buried. And I had been told that he knew everything about her, so I was surprised that it was not known where she was buried. And we still don't know. It's somewhere in the Catholic cemetery in Jackson, but we don't know where.
Nothing was found. So maybe nobody really took care of her, and she was buried in a common grave. It's quite possible. It's rather odd, because she had no direct heirs, and the contracts made with Douay provided that all the property she still owned would go to him. He could have made a small gesture, provided a small tombstone, something. So maybe he did, and it was lost. But maybe he didn't. In any case, nothing was found. And this injustice continued until 2004.
In 2004, Amador County celebrated its 150th anniversary and decided to honor the memory of Marie Pantalon by naming her Sesquicentennial Woman of the Year.
Now, there is this small monument that pays homage to Marie Pantalon.
In the city's small Catholic cemetery, a new plaque honors this absolutely extraordinary character, who left a vivid memory in the United States, more than in France, until the 21st century. Because she died and left no descendants, she was less talked about, and also the fact that her ranch was sold about 10 years after her death and changed its name. And then the French colony spoke less and less French, and the French press disappeared. Everything that could have kept her memory alive faded away, and she was almost forgotten. In tone, we frankly forgot her.
À Thônes, on l'oublie franchement.
Her brother Albert came to join her for a while and returned home. And at Savoyard gatherings, he continued to talk about his sister's extraordinary career.
Alors, je m'appelle Anne Rohrer.
My name is Anne Rohrer. I'm Marie Pantalon's great-great-niece.
Son frère.
Her brother came back from Jackson with a small scale that was used to weigh gold and a very small nugget that stayed in the family. So as children, we were fascinated by this story, even though people didn't talk about her much elsewhere. We in the family knew who Marie Pantalon was because her memory had been kept alive by the previous generations. Although she was at one time in her life not only rich but famous, this did not mean she belonged to a family who were aware of the importance of passing things down. By this I mean that she probably wrote letters to her family back in Tone to give them news, if only to keep in touch with her brothers, who were planning to join her. They knew where to find her, so there was some connection. But sadly, nobody kept any letters. If they did exist, there is no one, either herself or her family in Tone, who felt they were important enough to be preserved for future generations.
Pour les garder et nous permettre aujourd'hui de les lire. Et je dis ça parce que
I say this because with families that are far more aware of their importance and their social value, like aristocrats, there is a desire to preserve their heritage. This means that we now have a lot of documentation on these elite families, but we are sorely lacking such documents as regards much more modest families like Marie's.
Comme celle dont est issue Marie.
We need a story like Marie's about claiming our own voices, claiming our own freedom. And I think that's the biggest message that Marie left us.
Ce qui est fantastique avec l'histoire.
What is amazing with the story of Marie Pantalon and other women, in fact, is that by taking a little more interest in these forgotten women of history, as we do now, it opens new ways for us to understand that world better. If we look at it simply through the eyes of men, as we have for a very long time, we only get part of the story.